I viewed a recent discussion on the topic of whether our thoughts are material. The Christian holds that the process of thought is material, but thought itself is not. Atheists generally hold that all processes and outcomes of thought are solely material. They claim that all neuroscientists would agree. What are the implications for the Christian if our thoughts are wholly material? This question cuts a bit deeper than you might think of at first. The question, quite simply put, is, are my thoughts part of the material universe, or are my thoughts something different than that? Now, depending on how you think about thought, it really does color how we are conceiving of the question to begin with. It's perhaps easy to say, well, a thought is not something I can hold in my hand, but it also is the case that brain activity is, at least on the base level, an interaction between neurons and electricity. So it's somewhat of a more complicated question than you might think of at first. To set up this question, what's helpful to recognize is, once again, as you'll probably hear me say over and over again in this book, as Polkinghorne himself would say and Beale would say, every fact is an interpreted fact. Whenever we say that thoughts are something, that thoughts exist in the world, we are making an interpreted statement based upon not mere numbers or not mere experimentation, but an interpretation of those experiments. And so whenever we talk about thoughts as being even something that really exists in the universe, it's not simply illusory, that my experience of thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch is a real thing that I don't necessarily say is something I can hold in my hand in the same way that I can hold my coffee cup in my hand. Depending on what your perspective on the world is, or what your philosophy about objects is, really does color how you take what this question is asking. Let me give you an example. There is a philosophy that is sometimes called Physicalism. This is sometimes equated with materialism. In the philosophical sense, those aren't necessarily exactly the same thing, but we're going to use Physicalism as the description. Physicalism is the philosophy that everything in the world, everything, boils down to physical interactions. Everything that is real in the world is material, made of stuff. There's nothing in the world that is not made of stuff of some sort. And by stuff, we're meaning the things that we can measure in the world. So in other words, whenever I say stuff, I'm not merely referring to the stuff of my head. I can certainly imagine a unicorn. I can certainly think about a unicorn. In fact, I can certainly think about the fact that my children's rooms are filled with unicorns, the plushy sort, not the sort of biological sort. But the whole idea that a unicorn is real, we would probably broadly say, is not true. It's not a real biological thing. However, we get into some muddy territory here, because it is one thing to say that unicorns are not real in the biological sense, but it is completely the other thing to say that unicorns are not real to the mind or to the expression of the mind through the creative process of manufacturing plushy unicorns for children to enjoy worldwide. But what Physicalism would say about this problem would be that thinking about the unicorn itself is in fact a material process. Whenever I'm thinking about a unicorn, I am responding to various physical phenomena in the world. The unicorn doesn't just pop into my head. The unicorn comes to me from seeing depictions of unicorns, from seeing popular ways in which unicorns are drawn, in which they are interacting on my television screen. in the various shows that kids may watch. But drilling down even more, this idea doesn't come from nowhere either. It comes from observing a real horse and a real addition to the horse, the horn on the front of it, that we can see in other animals. We can see in other animals, horns are not unusual for cows. Horns are not unusual for goats. So it's not that we don't get these ideas from nowhere. They are a response to physical phenomena in which the physicalist will say, it is by the neuroscience of our brain in which we are observing physical phenomena. We are really, in a physical sense, taking that data into ourselves by electrical charges, by the ways in which our brain stores data, and then we are producing something different by use of our rationality, which is a function of our brain and a function of our neurology. We are simply spitting out ideas that we have taken into our data sets and then interpreted or molded into something and then spit it back out. This is where we have the idea of the brain as physical computer, that these are machines in which they are taking in physical data in real physical fashion by real physical processes and then putting out physical results into the world. In other words, it is a complex relationship between my physical brain and my perception of the world by physical processes, seeing the desk that's entering into my eye by a function of light and perception. We can get into all of these various physical descriptions of these things. What is the pushback on this? And I want to say it's not just theists that push back on this. There are a fair amount of atheists as well that see this as untenable. And the reason why they say this is untenable is because the very fundamental core thing about our brains is that if we use the computer analogy, we also run into a problem with that analogy, because we would say that even though hardware is the stuff that you put into the computer to be able to turn all the knobs and stuff like that, it would be a far-fetched thing to say that software in computers is simply a physical thing that manifests itself. For example, do we say that using the internet browser on our computer is using a physical item? Well, yes and no, because at its basic foundations, it is a turning on and off of ones and zeros. Yeah, we can say that, but we are not simply beholding ones and zeros in the physical format of electrical charges whenever we are using a browser that is built to do certain things in a non-material sense. Now, again, atheists will also push back against physicalism in saying that, no, there are things in the world that are by necessity non-physical. Emotional experiences, even though the substrate of emotion is perhaps caused by hormones and things like that, the thing is, though, is it caused by hormones? Or is it an experience of certain phenomena in the world that are not necessarily physical, but result in physical interaction? So now you begin to see the contours of the problem. It's merely a physical interaction that I'm interpreting as something else, or is it that I am actually experiencing something else that then results in physical outcomes? Perhaps an interesting point of view here is the placebo effect. Whenever we take in a placebo of a drug, we know that the placebo effect is actually quite powerful, because if we, whether it's our brain or whether it is our body or whether it is some combination of both of them, believe that we are taking a medicine that will make us feel better, there is actually a measurable way that we can say someone actually feels better, or there is actually a physiological reaction by what the person believes about what they are doing to their body, even if it is a placebo that is nothing more than a placeholder for medicine. So there's again a complex relationship between the physical, the material of the world, and the non-material world or non-physical world. There's several ways you can look at that. And the reason why I'm bringing up that atheists disagree on this is because this is a much wider issue than simply theism versus atheism. Let me give you what theists will then take, again, the data of what we see about this and how the theist would interpret the question of the mind. Are our ideas physical merely, or are they something different than that? Let's return to the analogy of the computer. The thing about the computer is that we are, by necessity, designing a machine to be able to do exactly what we tell it to do. And this is, for anybody who has done computer coding and knows how perhaps unintelligent computers are, they will do exactly what you tell them to do, even if what you tell them to do breaks the computer. There are ways in which the computer itself is subject to the fallible commands of the computer user. In other words, there's no sort of background intelligence for the computer to say, no, this is not a good idea, unless we build that into the system. We are building in safeguards that we design ourselves so that the computer does not harm itself by actions that we tell it to take. But the thing is that by the very necessity of that computer, and this is to return to an earlier philosophical project that I referenced way back in the first chapter, there was a question as to whether in computing, as we get more and more complex computer systems, that is artificial intelligence truly possible? Can we reach a point in which computers can think for themselves, so to speak? And I want to bring up a famous thought experiment by an atheist philosopher named John Searle. John Searle's thought experiment, called the Chinese room experiment, was basically an explanation as to computers not having the semantic ability to make sense of their inputs, but rather computers only have a syntactic ability. It is basically they are taking in a syntax and spitting out a syntax. They're not taking in what we see and making a rational judgment of something and then making an action out of that, but rather it is an action of exchange and not of creativity, I guess we could say. And Searle, as an atheist, says that this is why we need to be very careful about intelligence as simply being a physical interaction with the universe, but rather that there is something more going on than simply a syntax exchange, but there is a semantic rationality that is going on in which maybe it's not merely an input-output sort of experience, such as a computer is designed to function. So, with that said, think about some of the arts and humanities in human culture. As Beale and Polkinghorne pull up, the idea of famous music, the idea of famous paintings, when we are looking at or beholding or experiencing certain pieces of music, certain paintings, are we by necessity only experiencing the physical stuff of the world, or is there something above the physical that we are experiencing in these particular cases? They bring up the famous play of Shakespeare, Hamlet, in which we don't have a singular edition of that story, but that historically we have three separate ones that are called the same thing, that are very similar in the way that they're told, but that are varying slightly. And a performance of Hamlet, in the sense, is not really to perform the quote-unquote original version of Hamlet, but rather it is an art based upon an arranging of the material of Hamlet between these various sources and various versions in order to make a play of Hamlet that one can go and see. Now, it brings up the question, am I actually watching Hamlet? Or am I watching something Hamlet-like? Well, at least as it comes to the question of physical versus the immaterial, we can perhaps posit that Hamlet, in the art of telling a story, is perhaps no more material than the idea of the story. The story itself is not pen to paper. It's not something that we necessarily have a physical substrate for, to use that language, but rather the idea of the story, because Hamlet's a fiction, comes to us from some sort of immaterial sense, and that the ideas of Hamlet are not merely material that we are doing, because of course we're pulling all kinds of interactions from various sources and things like that. Is Hamlet physical or not? The theist is going to take the position that ideas are not merely physical. They interact with the physical, we can certainly say that, but they're not merely physical. There's something else going on in this. But to take it in the very theistic direction, we have a real question about the mind of God. If we are to say that the mind is something that is not merely a physical thing, but actually is, in a very, very real sense, a reflection of our Creator, then we run into the question of how exactly does that mind interact between the physical and the non-physical parts of the world? Is the mind a higher rationality that is only determined by how big our brains are, or is it a function of something beyond the mere physical, something that is immaterial? This comes into the focus of the question of evolution because we have a question of a physical, biological mechanic of the world that in some way, shape, or form is able to explain so very many things about the physical universe, and yet it is not by mere necessity, meaning that our minds arise out of a purely mechanical process, but rather there is something beyond the mechanical that is occurring that gives rise to certain things in the world rather than others. It's the question of how can we as humans make culture happen? And culture in the widest sense, not meaning our mere survival, not merely receiving our basic necessities, but our capacity for art and music and thought and science itself. Is there something beyond the mere mechanical of the world that explains so much more of the way that the world actually works? There is not necessarily, by virtue of the fact of the physical and the immaterial, a competition between whether you think that evolution is that thing that gives a rise to the mind, or whether you think that there is an intelligence beyond the physical universe that gives a rise to the mind. Because it's the same sort of thing as gravity is just the way that the world works. If we try the hat on of saying that the evolutionary biology of the world is what gives us the whats of the physical data we have, we then have to make the interpreted fact of how do we deal with those things that are, or at least seem to be, immaterial. Atheists are not of one mind as to whether the universe is purely physical or whether there are some non-physical parts of it. Theists are going to affirm that there are some non-physical parts of it, one of those non-physical parts being the rationality and the culture-making ability of humans. Where does that come from? Why, to use the meaning-making question, why do we have the ability to do this as opposed to other creatures within the world? It is a question of, is there something beyond the material as well as the interaction with the material. It's not a question of evolution versus creation. It's a question of the role of the physical and the non-physical. In that sense, we are open to make interpreted facts based upon other sets of data, and not just whether the mind is physical or not. Rather, it is, what are we making out of the data points that lead theists to say there are non-physical parts of the world. Now let's talk about why are there non-physical parts of the world. Should Christians simply accept evolution as science but refrain from becoming social Darwinists? Can a Christian who accepts evolution still take Christian living as seriously as the early church did? Does it put restraints on traditional Christian ethics, such as caring for the poor, sick, etc.? Just as we need to be careful about the philosophies of the materialist position, the physicalist position, versus those who believe in something that is non-material, so also we need to be very, very careful when we equate the idea of evolution with the philosophy of evolution. There's an interesting exploration of the thought process and the ways in which we think about things fundamentally differently culturally than we used to in the first publications of The Origin of Species. To try to summarize this as succinctly as possible, when we have the publication of The Origin of Species, we have an interesting thing that happens not only scientifically, but we see the types of thinking that the observation of certain scientific principles, we see the certain transference of certain kinds of thinking into other disciplines that may not necessarily be equated with the science itself. It's one thing to say that over a long geologic period of time, we have traits genetically that alter, change, adapt to various sorts of stimuli that allow for creatures to better survive, and that therefore fundamentally changes their genes that they pass on, and all of those particular genetic mutations and adaptations over time result in significantly different creatures than before. That is something that we can say in the kind of bare physical sense of interpreted data. It is something completely different to say that in the social realm that this happens as well. It would be as if to say that human civilization in the early human origins would be, we move from here and we have social adaptations that then apply to the passing on of social and cultural ways of thinking that then follow the bouncing ball down the line that we receive in some way, shape, or form in current day that have been adapted and changed and adjusted over time. It's certain things that kind of lead to a common understanding that, well, religion is just one of those things that is a vestigial remnant of something that helped humans culturally survive. Now, again, that is a significantly different claim than to say that there are genetic traits that allow species to survive in different places. We're making a really big leap between the science of biological evolution into the humanities, and I want to say this very forcefully, the humanities of historical study. When we view culture as evolutionary from a cultural perspective, that's a significantly different thing than what Darwin was trying to say about something completely genetic and scientific. So the thing is that we need to really, really carefully differentiate between equating evolutionary biology with the philosophy of cultural evolution. Now, let's get to the question that was asked. The question of isn't evolution unethical is a conflation between the science and the philosophy. The common philosophy that we probably all know is the idea of the survival of the fittest. Now, again, even modern evolutionary biologists will say that was a theory that has been somewhat pushed to the shelf because of other sorts of cultural and likewise community-making ways in which we observe that are more likely to help cultures survive than the mere who's the strongest, who can last the longest, so to speak. There are other factors that go into this, but the mistake is to conflate the biological science of evolution with a philosophical sort of standpoint in which we're saying, well, only the strongest cultures survive, or only the most adaptable cultures survive, or only the most adaptable people survive in the cultural sense. That's something quite different than to say that there is something biological going on in the mere bare fact of my physiology. Let me give you an example of this. It's something significantly different to say than when to use last class's example, when I take that horse from that one warm part of the world and I put it in a considerably cold part of the world, and the genetics of that horse switch on, switch off certain markers that allow for that horse to grow a much thicker coat to be able to survive in that environment. And in subsequent, let's say, generations of that particular breed of horse, we then have a type of horse following after that that inherits those markers that are able to survive in that particular context in a much more sustainable fashion. Now, that's one thing. Now let's take the logic jump that you can make in saying the survival of the fittest in that sort of philosophy. Now apply that to human culture. Then we would say that, as some have said in previous centuries, that the strongest human culture is the one that will survive the longest and will then give its ideas to the next set of human generations. And that survival of the fittest is, by virtue, the looking for the strongest or the most resilient culture or the most resilient, dare I say, nation or state or culture of the world. There is an extremely close relationship between cultural imperialism and what we see happen in the first part of the 20th century, which is the world wars. This also is something that creeps into the philosophy of the scientific perspective, that it results in something called eugenics, in that we are trying to self-engineer something that is, we would say, genetically pure or genetically stronger than before, and cutting off the weak parts. Now, you can do your own historical research on the idea of eugenics and the horrors of which that particular set of philosophical sets of beliefs then leads into a completely horrific application of something that, by its very nature, was never meant to be applied in that way. So, is evolution, by its very necessity, unethical? The careful philosopher and the careful scientist will say, not necessarily. We differentiate between the mechanic of adaptation and the philosophy of adaptation. The bare facts or the uninterpreted data, and we have to interpret that data in a certain way, and there are certain ways in which we interpret that data that are unethical ways of doing so. And to use the criticism that theists can levy at atheists is that when we try to create out of evolution what we would call a rival religion, and I'm using religion in the barest sense here, a religion being a set of beliefs that one must hold to in order to be considered in the orthodoxy. If we create out of evolution a religio, a set of beliefs that one has to hold in order to be considered intelligent, in order to be considered believable, then what we have done is we have created a philosophy surrounding this rather than the careful interplay between the physical data and the interpretation we make of it. The theist, for Polkinghorne and Beale, can make what they would say a good philosophical move by saying evolution is a way that we can see the physical interactions of the world working, and that it needs a philosophy undergirding it that makes better sense of the way that the world in its wide web of interactions actually works. In the chapter themselves, they refer to the fact that as we are in the kind of current state of things, we actually see that altruism, and not just altruism, but what the theist would call a sacrificial sort of altruism, is actually something that gives rise to a more sustainable and stronger sort of community than the simple reference and responding to good or evil in like kind, as in the game Tit for Tat that they reference in this chapter. And not to say anything about the success of those cultures, but rather that it yields, at least from a cultural standpoint, at least from a community standpoint, a stronger and more robust way of living in community in a sustainable sense. However, it does not provide the answers to the wider why questions of the world by its very necessity. So in other words, even though evolutionary biology, and likewise our study into what makes cultures sustainable and what makes certain webs of life sustainable, that does not still answer the question of what does it mean to take up your cross and follow me, to use their language in this chapter. It's not perhaps to set out on the road to success to carry your death with you. Rather, that is a significantly different kind of question, and one in which science, fact, uninterpreted fact by its own self is not built to answer. We have to be the ones to apply our other sorts of data sets, our philosophies, our worldviews, our leaps of faith, whether it be theist or atheist, in trying to interpret the facts in the most reliable fashion. And in that way, evolution, by its very bare data, is not something that need be in competition with an unethical worldview. We have to be extremely careful, though, to not conflate the science with the philosophies that undergird it. Does the apparent wastefulness of natural selection go some way to discrediting the idea that God is loving and merciful? How can a God of love allow a creation to develop where so many species die in often horrific and protracted suffering? I appreciate the idea that life was given the freedom to make itself, but still the developmental process that leads to sentiency seems nonsensically brutal. If it should be that evolution is a scientifically robust way of speaking about the way in which species come about, there is a real question of, well, we know of many species that are extinct now that used to exist. There are many creations in the world that have, we would say, fallen by the wayside. And the question is, if that's the case, why on earth would God make it so that parts of the creation no longer exist? Or by necessity of the natural selection process, why would it be that God would create a world with waste in it that have, again, using perhaps the metaphor of the wastebasket, that there are certain species that are crumpled up and thrown into the wastebasket while others take their place? Well, I think that this is a good question. And it, again, brings back the question of how exactly are we interpreting the creation of the world in Genesis? On the one hand, in the creation accounts, you see God creating all that is, and that all of this cluster of creative web of creation, so to speak, is then put into its places in its proper contexts. God, in a sense, creates order out of the chaos of the world. There was, God is arranging various things in the creation stories and is making it so that everything is in an ordered fashion. That's why there's a garden in Eden, right? It's not simply that there's just a whole bunch of trees and stuff that's just unkempt, but rather there is a garden. There's an order to the way that God is ordering the beginning of creation. And in evolution and evolutionary biology and in historical studies and archaeological studies, there seems to be painting a picture of a vast amount of chaotic sort of nature to the world, an unordered sort of way. And is that contrary, or is that repugnant to the idea that God creates in a ordered fashion and in a non-wasteful fashion? Well, this is a big question. But one of the parts of this question is when species fall by the wayside, the question of suffering is a real live wire question, because this is a bit of a controversial thing to say, but there is a philosophical distinction between species that suffer versus other things that do not, by necessity, do that. Let me use an example from some of our more imaginative ideas of artificial intelligence. In a lot of movies, you have this idea of artificial intelligence as being unfeeling. And one of the reasons why this is an important sort of thing is that to feel something or to conceive of a meaning-making activity of the feelings that I have of pleasure, pain, and otherwise, is something that we often ascribe to rationally functioning creatures that are able to experience that in a reflective fashion. Now, I'm using that very carefully. To reflect on my own self is something in which touches on one of the great mysteries of both science and philosophy, which is the mystery of consciousness. It's not just that I feel something negative. It's not simply that when I pinch myself, I feel something I would call pain. But rather, it's that I can reflect on this feeling of pain. It's not merely that I'm experiencing a stimulus. It's that I am reflecting on the experience of that stimulus. Memory is something that is tied in with consciousness. And the recollection of that pain and the reflection on the meaning of that pain is something that is significantly different than the lizard that is crawling across the ground that has an experience of pain that causes a particular sort of reaction in the kind of base instinctual sense. We don't really have anything that leads us to think that the lizard reflects on that pain other than simply the reaction to the stimulus. But in creatures such as humans, there is a rational capability to reflect on the meaning of that pain, which is something fundamentally different that brings up the idea of suffering. Because when we talk about suffering, we're talking about a reflection on why am I feeling pain? Why am I in this state of pain? Why am I in this state of personal uncomfortableness, so to speak? And of course, suffering can be as banal as my leg falling asleep while I'm sitting in this chair, or as serious as someone who has cancer and who is undergoing significantly painful procedures to deal with an aggressive disease. The meaning of why do I feel pain is a rational reflective process that is not universal to all species in the world. And so we have a real question as to whether the species that used to exist in the world, that existed many, many, many millions of years ago, actually conceived of what was going on as suffering. And that might seem cold to our world that so often applies human characteristics to non-human things, to inanimate objects as well as to other animals and things like that. It might seem cold to say that. But whenever we look at how we're looking at the rest of the world, we have to, at least in some cases, assign a gradation of reflectiveness, of certain functions of the rationality, as opposed to others. This, of course, is exactly why we can, in some cases, say that we can use the goods of the material world at all and not be committing some sort of heinous action of cutting down the tree or of eating the apple. Because if it should be that species are suffering, we are, by necessity in that case, causing the suffering of other things. If, however, there is a gradation of rationality that applies to the reflective process, then I think we have a little bit less of a nervousness around whenever I go home and I'm eating something that was produced from the ground, or I'm eating meat, or something like that. Now, again, this is nothing to touch on the ethics of how we're treating the physical universe by bare fact of its creative goodness, which is a different question than suffering. But rather, we are asking ourselves, do we have a problem with reflective suffering in others? Now, again, this is a particularly thorny issue. It's not to say that suffering does not exist in non-human creatures. We, again, have a question of rationality that is still being worked out in various theories and in various data. But the question of, is evolution wasteful, really is a function of how exactly we are thinking about the relationship between God and the creation as self-making. If we are to fundamentally say, or to take the worldview that creation is imbued with this creativeness after her creator, then we have this sort of imperfect imprint, in that we are creative perhaps to a fault. There are certain ways in which life is self-making that is not sustainable in the long run. Not that that is wrong, but that is simply a function of the way that life is able to self-make in the first place. In other words, we cannot get to where we're at today in life's ability to self-make by virtue of her creator without having those steps along the way that are no longer necessary, or, to just be blunt about it, no longer existing. And again, this even for me personally, seems like a cold thing to say. But there is, when we think carefully about it, a difference in saying that the dinosaurs that existed, many, 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 many years ago, the dinosaurs that existed many years ago suffered in their extinction. It's fundamentally different to say that than to say that someone is suffering from a incurable disease. Whereas we can never really know if there have been rational creatures before humans. We simply don't have the ability to test that at this moment. We can at least say that for those who have the ability to reflect on the stimulus of which we receive in the world, have a much more difficult question to answer about that. But that gets into a meaning of suffering question, not necessarily into an evolutionary question. You see what I'm saying? It's rather than saying that evolution in and of itself is a problematic or a system that causes suffering. We rather can perhaps more appropriately say that whenever we cast onto evolutionary biology the necessity of answering the question of suffering, we actually are simply relocating a problem that is present no matter what system you have of the arising of life in the world. no matter whether you're a 6-day literal creationist or whether you're a theistic evolutionist, you still have that question, just in a different sort of way. And perhaps we could say that it's not necessarily that we need to treat evolution as wasteful, but rather we have to appropriately situate it in the interpreted sets of facts about the world in which we're trying to make philosophical sense of why are we here in the first place, which is a why question, not a what question.